Good afternoon. My name is Bob Nelson, and I'm President and CEO of UFA Cooperative in Calgary, Alberta. UFA stands for United Farmers of Alberta. We're a retail agricultural cooperative with over 100,000 members. Our relationship with St. Mary's University goes back quite some time, with a number of students having participated and graduated from the MBA program, also acting in an advisory capacity on the CMEC Board of Directors. Our subject this afternoon, as Denise said, is Are Prosperity and Sustainability Compatible? Our speaker is Dr. William Rees. Dr. Rees is a professor emeritus at the University of British Columbia in Western Canada in the School of Community and Regional Planning. Dr. Rees is best known and recognized as the originator of ecological footprint analysis, as set out in his work in the realm of human ecology and ecological economics. Dr. Rees' current work includes sustainability implications of globalization and getting serious about urban sustainability. Dr. Rees will be followed by commentator, Mr. Ed Mayo, Secretary General of Cooperatives UK. Cooperatives UK is the national trade body that campaigns for cooperation and works to promote, develop, and unite cooperative enterprises. Mr. Mayo is recognized as being highly influential in British social policy, with a track record for bringing innovation and impact in his work to bring together economic life and social justice. I look forward to hearing both of these gentlemen's perspectives this afternoon. Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Bill Rees?
Thank you very much, Robert. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm exceedingly grateful, actually, to have been invited to address this particular group, because I, as many others have said, believe that cooperatives hold a key to any progression that we're going to make, any progress we're going to make on solving this particular problem. We've reached the point in the conference where it's sometimes a little difficult to find something entirely new to say, so I'm going to try to emphasize in a different way some of the things that have already been underscored for us. I have three major points I want to get across. The first is I want to describe the problem as I see it, which is slightly differently perhaps. I'm a biological scientist from the way some others have talked about it. I want to talk a little bit about why the problem exists, not in a trivial proximal sense, but in the more distal sense. And I want to underscore that we have the potential to solve this problem, but also that we show very little signs, certainly as a global intelligence, to addressing this problem in any ways that are going to get us out of a hole. So that's my starting point for the analysis. As you know, I've been handed a topic: are prosperity and sustainability compatible? I have to define what those terms mean. Others have already done this pretty much. Prosperity in most people's minds in North America means having a lot of money and expecting to get more of it. I think we need to be much broader than that and to simply define it as material sufficiency combined with spiritual well-being for all. I think if we think of it in those terms, we can move forward. Sustainability is actually a more difficult concept. There are hundreds of definitions, most of which are meaningless and in fact contradictory. I think here are two ways of looking at it that might move us a little forward. A system is ecologically sustainable if it could continue to function indefinitely in its current configuration or maintain its current trajectory indefinitely without undermining the biophysical or social basis of its existence. In economic terms, we can talk about a society or an economy being sustainable if prevailing levels of production and consumption do not reduce real wealth. That is to say, do not erode the natural capital and human and financial capital base of that society on a per capita basis. So there's a number of variables in there that we need to keep in mind if we're going to move forward. The bottom line is we can't destroy the fundamental basis of our own existence, be it social, economic, or ecological, if we're going to move forward. So what makes us unsustainable? I'm going to address this as a biologist, as an evolutionary ecologist for a moment, and point out that there are a number of factors about which we are not conscious, but which drive us constantly. And the first is that we are what ecologists would call a K-strategist in our reproductive strategy. We are large, long-lived organisms with a low reproduction rate, with extensive parental care, and high infant survival rates. Hence, we constantly press up against local carrying capacities. That was Malthus's great insight. So we have the potential always to follow that blue line. That's our population growth potential. Normally, human populations follow the red line. They're suppressed by negative feedback, disease, resource shortages, and so on, and eventually level out at about carrying capacity. Whoops. Oh, there we go. So the two drivers that, again, we're all affected by this, but unconsciously. Unless or until constrained by that negative feedback, human populations, like all other species, will expand to fill all the available habitat. There is no species on the planet better at doing this than we are. We occupy all the occupiable habitat on Earth, and many that really we oughtn't to be in at all. The second thing we do, and again, it's just something all species do, is use up all the accessible resources. Again, we're better at it than other species because of technological advances. And if you think about this for a moment, look at where we're now exploring for oil and many other minerals in places that technologically were absolutely impossible just a few years ago, and yet we will continue to scrape the bottom of our earthly barrel until we get it all out. In addition to that, we have a cultural narrative. Human beings are storytellers. Our stories are vastly more important than current data, for example. And we have currently a global cultural narrative that is dependent on two primary components that you're all familiar with. The myth of continuous technological progress, we've heard a great deal about that, and the myth of perpetual growth. Here are just two quotes that capture that. Lawrence Summers, when he said this, president, or at least the chief economist of the World Bank, later the president of Harvard University, later the chief advisor of President Barack Obama's Economic Policy Council. There are no limits to the carrying capacity of the Earth that are likely to bind at any time in the foreseeable future. Even more ebullient was Julian Simon, management science at the University of Maryland, until his death a few years ago. Technology exists now to produce in inexhaustible quantities all the goods and services produced by nature. Now, clearly, if you believe both of these stories, there is no environmental problem. Humans can go forward, grow perpetually without any ecological constraints whatsoever. This is not a model. This is the real population growth curve followed by humanity over the past 2,000 years. Note that it's exactly the shape, if I can go back here quickly to that curve, of the blue line. We are expressing our full potential in recent times because we have been relieved of the negative feedback primarily by fossil fuels. Now, there's a couple of points to be taken here. The first is that we could have flatlined that line to the left for 50 or 100,000 years, virtually the whole history of modern humans, and what you would notice is that growth is an anomaly. That the last 200 years, perhaps 8 generations of human existence, we've experienced explosive growth. We take this to be the norm because we've all lived through it, but this is the single most anomalous period in the history of our species. This release from negative feedback, food shortages, resource shortages, disease, and so on, is largely attributable to our discovery of how to use fossil fuel. And here are 3 curves that just match this up perfectly. Population on the left, and our per capita and gross use of fossil fuels on the right. They are a perfect match. This is a great concern because we clearly cannot hope to be sustainable at anything like even today's average material living standards if we don't discover a substitute for fossil fuel. And there's no sign on the horizon that this is likely to happen. As you can see, even by 2040, the world's major energy analysts argue that we will not have more than 10 or 11% of alternative energy. Everything else is oil and gas, and notice there's no reference here whatsoever to the climate change problems associated with that. Now, what we've seen then is a combination of biological drivers that push people forward like bacteria on a petri dish to fill the whole planet and use all of resources, currently being reinforced by a cultural narrative that makes that okay. And so it's hardly surprising that we have an enormous ecological footprint. Your ecological footprint, this is this tool that we've designed and is now being used all around the planet, is simply a measure of the ecosystem area required to produce the resources that you or a population consumes and to assimilate primarily your carbon wastes. Everyone has a footprint. It is measurable. We heard this morning that we could put the entire world population in Lake Superior living on 12 square feet of water surface. The reality is that each of us in North America has an ecological footprint of between 7 and 10 hectares. You know, there's a bit of latitude here. Let's say 8 hectares. 8 hectares per capita is the average amount of productive ecosystem needed to sustain each of us in this room. The poorest of the poor get by on a fraction of that, less than half a hectare in some instances. So just as Richard Wilkinson's income differentials show up in most of his other variables, the ecological footprint is a direct reflection of one's purchasing power in the global economy. In these terms, globalization can be seen as a form of neocolonialism in that we now achieve through commerce precisely what used to require territorial occupation. In other words, it gives rich nations access to other people's bioproductivity through trade and by dumping into the global commons. North Americans use 4 times their fair share of the Earth's biocapacity. And this is the fundamental way of measuring that. Right now on Earth, anybody can do these numbers. There are about 12 billion productive hectares of land and water, sufficiently productive to sustain human life. There are 7 billion people, each with an average eco-footprint of about 2.7 hectares. So the human eco-footprint today is 18 billion hectares compared to only 12 billion available productive hectares. How can we be living on a planet that seems to be 50% larger than the one we have? By depleting our natural capital. We are degrading the fish stocks. We're degrading our soils. We're ruining the atmosphere. We're acidifying the oceans. All of these things are evidence of a phenomenon called overshoot. The human population in its current demands, which on average are unsatisfactory, already exceeds the bioproductive capacity of the planet, the ability of Earth to replenish the assets that we use. We passed something called Overshoot Day on the 22nd of August this year. That's the date by which in this year the human population has already used more of the assets produced by the ecosystems of Earth. And for the rest of that year, then, effectively, we're living by degrading or debasing or depleting the natural capital assets that sustain us. That's the very definition of unsustainability. This is just one indicator, the rising carbon dioxide levels as measured in the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii, showing the steady increase, the degree of overshoot in our use of carbon fuels. And the rate, by the way, has almost doubled in the last 40 years. A society in overshoot invites collapse. We are literally undermining the foundations upon which we stand. So for some period of time, because there are such large built-up stocks of capital, we can continue to consume above and beyond the reproductive capacities of nature. But at some point, we so deplete the capital that it can no longer support and sustain us, and that culture will go down. Now look, we are a unique species in some other respects. I've underscored ways in which we are similar to other species, but here are 5 in which we stand out. The first is that we have an unparalleled capacity for evidence-based reasoning and logical analysis. No other species has that. We have a unique ability to plan ahead. No other species can look at the data, logically analyze it, and determine policies that can change its own future. We have the potential to do that. We have a capacity for moral judgment unequaled by any other species. We have the ability to feel compassion, to feel empathy with other individuals and other species. Other species have this, but we have it to a greater degree. These are unique qualities of humankind, and they will be essential should we want to pull out of this dilemma that we are in. Now, one other thing that no other species has to our degree is a predisposition to cooperate, and that's why I think all of us are here today. So where does this all come together? Why is it, with these absolutely unique qualities, Why is it that the world community, particularly the rich and economically powerful countries on the planet, have failed utterly to reduce or substantially change the current trajectory of our civilization? Why is the income gap far from narrowing, based on the evidence we heard earlier this morning or at lunch, widening in virtually every country and between countries on the planet? And why is it? A wonderful statement by David Orr back in 1994, the depletion and pollution of the planet is not the work of ignorant people, not the work of the impoverished. It is the work instead of people with BAs, BScs, LLBs, MBAs, and PhDs. The best educated people on the planet have been trained in a story that is so fundamentally incompatible with the nature of biophysical reality that it cannot fail but to lead to the problem that we are in. Now, what I've really underscored is captured entirely in this editorial cartoon, which has to be one of the most brilliant I've ever seen. We have the intellectual power to recognize that the end of the world scenario is filled with unimaginable horrors, but instead, we continue in the pursuit of growth and profit. And this is this cognitive dissonance with which we are struggling. In Canada, we see an economic plan based entirely on the exploitation and export of natural resources, particularly fossil fuels, which makes us one of the world's great exporters of climate change and utterly dependent on a staples export economy of the kind that we had in the 18th and 19th century. And we call this economic development. Come on, people, let's wake up to the reality of our situation. It's not a great national triumph to become one of the world's greatest exporters of climate change, for example. So the problem is this, that we have tension in our minds. We are, on the one hand, highly intelligent, capable of understanding and analyzing those data, but we pay no attention to them. So we live in cerebral consciousness. But when we are threatened in any way, and again this came up in one of Richard Wilkinson's talk, when anything from our simple comfort to our safety or survival or social status are under threat from any source, we tend to deny and reject that kind of information. The fact of the matter is we are not rational species primarily. We are emotional and instinctive. And passion and instinct often trump reason when it comes to dealing with the kinds of problems that we're confronted with today. The second level of this is particularly pernicious. Cognitive psychologists understand now that during the development of individuals, if you are exposed to a particular social context or continually confront experiences in your education, in your family settings, and so on and so forth, where the same ideas are repeated over and over and over again so that you assimilate them, these repetitive thoughts literally create synaptic circuits in the brain. You acquire a physical presence of a way of thinking. And when those circuits are stimulated by any reference to any element of them, the whole brain wave, the whole brain circuitry lights up. We can now detect this with electromagnetic resonance machines and so on. The main point here is that once people have acquired a particular cultural narrative, a particular academic paradigm, a religious doctrine, they tend to seek out experiences that reinforce their pre-existing understanding of the nature of things, and they tend, when confronted with contrary information, to deny, discredit, reject, or forget that information. We are a culture in deep social and cultural denial of the nature of our own dilemma, and that's the only explanation that makes sense to me about how we can continue to develop in ways that are entirely in confrontation with the kinds of data that are readily available, and I think even in the social context that Richard Wilkinson talked about, out there for all to see, and yet we don't respond to them. By the way, this was a horrible shock to me as a scientist, where we are trained to assume that better data leads to better analysis, leads to better decision making. My career suggests to me that nothing could be further from the truth. Now, the right wing have been extremely adept at understanding exactly what I've talked to you about. And it goes back to a very important memo written in the 1970s. I haven't got time to explain it all. But the point is that the right wing, the kind of capitalist corporate sector, if you like, in North America, has intentionally attempted to reinforce the prevailing cultural paradigm over the past several decades in all of our media, in all of our social discourse around the economy, so that over and over and over again, we hear that it's all about the individual, the atomistic human, the individual person devoid of family, devoid of community. Free markets have become the wellspring of all social values. Deregulation is absolutely necessary because governments are always inefficient despite data to the contrary. We have the progress myth and perpetual income growth through economic specialization, globalization, trade, efficiency. You're all very familiar with these ideas because they are constantly repeated in all of our media all of the time. So effective is this propaganda that millions of people, particularly in North America, but increasingly elsewhere, now vote against their own interests because they bought into the model. This is a strikingly maladaptive paradigm, both ecologically and socially. Listen to me. Unsustainability is an inevitable emergent property between two entirely incompatible systems. The way we think about society, ecologies, and even economies, and the way those things actually operate as complex systems. The point I'm trying to get at here is that because these are fundamentally incompatible, the way we think about things and the way they actually are, that no amount of tinkering at the edges, no amount of trivial reform, which is all we're willing to talk about in the mainstream, is going to begin to address that problem. We really need, for example, to talk about how do we achieve absolute reductions on the order of 50% or more globally in some instances of energy and material throughput. So the new reality is that we have to realize that resource shortages are real, that ecological constraints of climate change are real, that they will affect us. There will be, assuming the data are correct, an end to this current anomalous period of growth. In fact, I think it's going to come within the next couple of decades and result in rapid descent. So that in coming decades, we will experience an absolute reduction, geographically uneven one, I suspect, in gross economic activity. The scale of the economy is going to decline whether we like it or not. And frankly, it's a long overdue economic adjustment. Now, we can either sit back and wait for this to be imposed upon us by nature in revenge, by violent climate change or some other cataclysmic flip over of some major natural system, or we can choose to become fully human, to rise to the challenge of our using our capacity for intellectual analysis, a logical analysis of the data. We can choose to use our capacity to plan ahead. The stupidest thing we could do in these circumstances is let the market decide. The market is as dumb as a post and doesn't contain most of the information needed to make the kinds of decisions that are necessary to pull us through this. So there's our choice. Will we allow or wait until nature imposes as a solution, or will we rise to the challenge of using the talents that we've been given as a species? And make no mistake, we are on course for the kind of collapse predicted in the Limits to Growth study back in 1972. The standard run scenario is the green line. The purple dots are real world. You know, economists rejected this report and trashed it the moment it came out as irrelevant and all the rest of it. It was crude. But no matter how crude it was, the real data in 30 years of information following the publication of that report show that the standard run is dead on and that the planned stabilization scenario is nowhere close to what we're seeing happening out there. Here's the really inconvenient truth, if you followed the drift of my argument so far. By the way, this is a fairly modest reduction compared to some of those that come to us from climate science, for example. For sustainability with equity, that narrower margins of income distribution that we talked about earlier today, we should be in Europe taking steps, active, purposeful steps to reduce our ecological footprints by 60%. North Americans need to reduce by about 80%, 75 to 80%. That is the necessary reduction to bring us down to the point where each of us is living on our fair share of the Earth's biological capacity. And look, even if the numbers are out by 25%, the direction is clear, and yet it's not being discussed in any serious mainstream situations thus far. Here's the other dimension of this. No individual or nation can achieve sustainability on his or her own. Sustainability, listen to this horrid word, is a collective problem. You can't even use the term collective today without being chased out of the room. But the reality is that this is a collective problem. It requires collective solutions. And for the first time in the history of the human species, if our basic science is correct, and who's to dispute it at this point, individual self-interest has converged with humanity's collective interests. So that if we all pursue our individual goals, we're goners. But if we get together and recognize that our mutual survival is at stake, we can pull it off. Achieving sustainability, then, requires an unprecedented level of cooperation and myriad cooperative institutions at all spatial scales, from global, kind of a framework agreement within which individual nations and cities and states and so on will implement their national plans. We need to recognize that human beings are capable of a very wide spectrum of behavioral propensities. Individualism, selfishness, short-term gratification, indifference, and disengagement are all part of each of us. But we're also capable of being socially oriented or community-oriented. We do engage in mutual altruism to a greater extent than any other species. Longer-term delayed gratification is something that many of us practice. Compassion and empathy, cooperative engagement, all of these things are possible. Now, the main point is that which of these qualities emerges as the template upon which society is built is entirely determined by the cultural context in which we move forward. We have spent 40 years emphasizing the left side of this graph. I should have put it on the right, I suppose. But the point of the matter is we've emphasized precisely what I call the darker colors of the human behavioral spectrum at the expense of the lighter colors. We need to, therefore, recognize, if again the science is correct, and I can't find anything basically wrong with it, that the economic policy emphasis must shift from efficiency and growth, merely getting bigger, as someone has emphasized this morning, toward equity and development, which is qualitative improvement, getting better. Getting better is better than getting bigger. The underpinning values of society must shift from competitive individualism, greed, and narrow self-interest toward community, cooperation, and our collective interests in survival. I don't see that it can work any other way. We need to shift from the neoliberal framing that has been repeatedly and constantly imposed upon us and is continuing to be imposed upon us of growth, efficiency, maximum scale, capital accumulation, substitution among different kinds of capital, minimal interference in markets, and what I call everybody calls weak sustainability. We must move toward recognizing a steady state economy. Your bodies are steady states that are developing. A constant throughput of energy and material keeps you in a non-growth state, but you can continue to learn, develop your skills, friendships, relationships. Development is not growth. We need then to decide what is the optimal scale of the economy, and many of Richard's slides showed us what that might look like. We need to recognize the need for qualitative improvement rather than capital accumulation, complementarity among capital types, active intervention to correct for market failures, many of the things that we've heard about earlier, and of course strong sustainability. Local economies for people and the earth. We need to deglobalize. Globalization exposes the remaining pockets of scarce resources to an ever larger marketplace of richer and richer people, absolutely predicting their decline. That's why the cod stocks collapse. It's not because Canadians eat too much fish, it's because the global demand for the product exceeded the capacity of those ground fish stocks to produce themselves. So as we reduce our global reach, it's not to say we become isolationist, but trade must be constrained by the ecological realities in which the global economy goes forward. We must simultaneously relocalize, reskill our domestic populations, diversify local economies through import displacement where possible and practical, increase the local and national self-reliance in food, energy, and other essential resources, completely at odds with what we're doing today in an era of specialization and interdependencies that mean we all crash at the same time. We need to invest in rebuilding our local, national, and natural capital stocks, fisheries, forests, soils, and so on and so forth. forth. We need to advance producer and consumer cooperatives as an efficient, effective, and equitable way to achieve the economic stability that we're all after. And I think the Mondragon co-ops are, in their original form, are a pretty good example of how we might go forward. We've heard about job sharing. This is, I think, an absolutely essential part of this. Through the measures I've already touched upon, and job sharing, sharing the work, sharing the resources, we can have actually greater job security, more satisfying terms of work, greater regional economic diversity, increased self-reliance, and these other things. This is the bottom line, a higher quality of life is at least theoretically possible with less material consumption and pollution, and therefore with sustainability. It won't be the materially over-rich life that we enjoy today. It'll be a richer, a more emotionally and spiritually satisfying life and an adequate level of material dependence. The problem is, and this goes back to, again, the ingrained prejudices against the kind of language I'm using here. And we've known about this, again, for centuries. Probably the best articulation of it back in the 19th century was Gustave Le Bon's study of the crowd. It's called The Crowd, a Study of the Popular Mind. It has many statements like this. The masses have never thirsted after truth. They turn aside from evidence that is not to their taste, preferring to deify error. That's our policymakers today. That's even most ordinary people on the street today who've bought into the more is better kind of attitude. Derek Jensen, American pop philosopher, said much the same thing just a few years ago in a wonderful little book called The Language Before Words. For us to maintain our way of living, we must tell lies to each other and especially to ourselves. The lies are necessary because without them, deplorable acts would become impossibilities. Now there's a very good statement of Canadian energy development policy in a nutshell. We can see whole pages of editorials about this with no reference whatsoever to the climate implications, to the moral implications of destroying other people's lives through climate change while we enrich ourselves by depleting an asset that, by the way, is already in the ground and therefore safely out of sight and out of mind if we leave it there. Denial, and I'm arguing that we're in a great state of cultural denial. I also see I'm out of time, so I'll make this the last slide. Is unfortunately tripping us up, and it has tripped up many societies before this one. If you have not read it, you should read Joseph Tainter's book, The Collapse of Complex Societies, and as a chaser, try Collapse, Why or How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed by Jared Diamond. They talk, without using necessarily the language, about societies in denial, and Tainter's bottom line is this: what is most intriguing in the history of human civilizations is the frequency with which increasing complexity is interrupted by collapse. They ignore the negative signals that they've gone over the top, and that culture is doomed to go down. There is no reason why our society needs to repeat this cycle. If we wake up, we take to the streets, the major things that make social change are either catastrophe, as we heard earlier, or civil insurrection. I'm not advising it, I'm not advocating it. But until there is sufficient evidence to the politicians that ordinary people have finally got it, that they're not satisfied any longer with the way in which our policymakers are taking us, they're not going to change. They will continue to listen to the advice from the corporate lobbyists who have currently bought and sold Congress and much of the House of Commons in Ottawa. Let's wake up, people. It's time to answer the door. Thank you very much.
Well, Bill, Bob, Denise, Tom, and all the St Mary's team as well. I'm Ed Mayo from Cooperatives UK, and in responding, Bill, to that, I have to say you've done something quite special here, quite amazing, which is that you've been more downbeat than Manfred Max Neef this morning. And that was a genuine truth-telling exercise, and in responding, I absolutely want to pay tribute to your leadership and work in and around the ecological footprint over such a long period of time. And in responding, I want to offer a proposal, a fable and a song. Now, we know in some ways that the ecological footprint that you set out, if anything, you could be even more negative and bleak. The idea that the whole biosphere is available for human use just does not stack up. You could say that things were a third or a fifth even worse than you have set out. But to be effective is all about how it's translated into activity and plans, transition plans at a business level or at a national level. So let's just explore what it means for kind of economics and for business. We've heard, I think, very convincingly that the weakness of mainstream economics is the extremity of its assumptions about human nature, assumptions about social structures, assumptions about the capacity of the biosphere. Sometimes even the assumptions that are there don't get put into practice. Competition theory, for example, assumes that there are no assumptions, but I haven't seen a single competition authority overseeing business around the world that has factored in some of the externalities that you've talked about in terms of greenhouse gas emissions or indeed species loss or pesticide use. We've had now many years of alternative frameworks for economics, at least 30 years of ecological economics organized internationally, arguably over 100 years of welfare economics. Stefania Zamaniu talked yesterday about the relatively new field over the last couple of decades of experimental economics using cooperative game theory and the like. And the difficulties with these is that these simply aren't brought into the kind of black box of mainstream economic policy. Elinor Ostrom, who would have been here, as was noted yesterday, was the first co-winner of the Nobel Prize for Economics, or its equivalent, and that was after Amartya Sen as well. We do have fantastic cooperative economists that are applying it. Keynes said that economists should aspire to be useful, like dentists. And I think if we're to take cooperative economics out, we need to make something that is proven and useful out there in the real world. And Samuel Bowles and Herbert Gintis are doing exactly that. For example, looking at issues around spreading ownership and its impact on productivity and the tackling of inequality. So my first response is to put a proposal up, whether for the team at St Mary's or cooperators around the world, is that we look towards an award to recognise cooperative economists, rather than relying on the one in every 120 years of the official Nobel Prize. Ecological economics, as set out in the work of people like Herman Daly, talks a lot about scale, and you've talked about that, the limits that you can go to, the idea that we have to organise our business, our consumption, our kind of work within the limits of scale. Another word for that is enough. So the second part of my response, I'd like to tell you a fable. And the fable starts on the shores of a fishing village with a fisherman lounging by the bank. And a financier, Harvard-trained financier, turns up and asks the fisherman why he is lounging around. Why isn't he out fishing? And he says, well, I caught enough fish this morning to share around, and this afternoon someone else in the cooperative is doing the fishing. So the financier says, well, hold on. If you fished more, then the cooperative could sell extra fish and make you loads more money. And the fisherman said, why? And the financier said, well, with the money, the cooperative could put down a deposit for a loan. You could buy more boats and hire other people to operate them. And the fisherman in the cooperative looks at the financier again and says, why? And the financier says, well, troubled at having to explain these simple things. Well, then you could make even more money, and you could sell out the business to somebody else, and then you could all retire. And the fisherman looks at him again patiently and says, "Why would we want to do that?" And the financier says, exasperated, "Well, then you could spend your days lounging about on the wharf and fishing as much as you pleased." And the fisherman said, "But that's what I'm doing right now." A sense of, can you get ideas of enough and bring that into the model and incentives for business? Now, the practical side of this is that cooperative businesses operate within wider markets. We are, as one person described, seawater fish in a freshwater pond. And the question is, can you have a sustainable business in an unsustainable market? Just as can you have a sustainable Canada in an unsustainable kind of world? Peter Marks from the cooperative group has talked to me about the risk, as he sees it, of ending up as the largest ethical business, that is, in the corporate graveyard. That you have to find your way through issues of values and sustainability in ways that have a purchase on the market as well, at large. And I think what's interesting about cooperatives with our democratic basis is the extent to which, in doing that and in widening the envelope for action on these issues, for hope on these issues, we are a bit like a crab walking sideways towards sustainability, building that mandate for action at different levels, individual levels, as well as levels that are political at the national and international level as well. It's a model, a cooperative model, that I think I call I will if you will. We'll take action and bring others with us. Now, in the UK, we have around 6,000 cooperative enterprises, and 88% of these, I'm proud to say, report that they actively seek to minimise their environmental impact, and that's twice the level for UK business at large, even if there's another 12% still to go. The cooperative sector is growing fast in a number of areas. Retailing is core. We're seeing the emergence of cooperative schools, bringing cooperation rather than competition into the classroom, and renewable energy cooperatives, cooperative energy is here represented in the room. It's a good sustainability area. We've been active on environmental issues. We contributed just last week to a campaign called 50 Months, which argues that we have only 50 months to take action at a national and international level in order to avoid what will be then the certain onset of temperature rises above 2 degrees centigrade. And in simple terms, that is catapulting us into a global gamble of unprecedented proportions. We've also been spreading the idea that in being part of the cooperative economy, people are being part of a movement that can take action on some of these big environmental issues. I guess we're more hopeful than that I found always rather pernicious late 19th century book on crowds. Cooperatives have always been the opposite, actually. We trust in a collective wisdom of crowds. We've launched a smartphone app, and it's available for use for borrowing around the world. NCBA in the States, I know, has launched their own version, which links you up with cooperative outlets right across our kind of nations in the UK, and builds a sense of what can be done. The Move Your Money campaign, which has spread from the States to the UK, New Zealand and others, argues for people to move their money out of capitalist banks into cooperative and mutual banks and credit unions. And 500,000 people in the UK have moved their current account away from shareholder banks from the start of this year. And in closing, then, a proposal, a fable, and a song. I'm delighted to share with you that just this week marks the 50th year anniversary of the launch of the first Beatles single, Love Me Do. I'm not going to sing it. It was launched by the Beatles beautifully, playing at the Cooperative Centre in Nuneaton in the UK. And I think I'd like to bring us through to the song of another of the Beatles, John Lennon. The song is Imagine, or Imaginons, as we now know. And I hope that the song may go for the future. Imagine a world with shared possessions. You may say, I'm a cooperator, but I'm not the only one. And I hope one day you'll join us, and the world will live within the biosphere's physical carrying capacity, aligned with the ecological footprint, and one planet living. Brothers and sisters, thank you very much.